America is changing before our very eyes. But it's a change that we were promised would happen before, and it didn't happen. We are a nation that continues to fool ourselves into thinking that when we say never again about certain things in this country, that it will just go away. Not this time, because the murder of a man in broad daylight, recorded on video, has set a torch to America right now that, quite frankly, has long ago needed to be set and needs to be discussed. And this time, if we do say never again, we have to make sure that it sticks. We'll talk about that and so much more as America goes through a change that it desperately needs, but some people are not along with that at all as we continue and we move on and we start this special edition of The Man in the Arena.
Theodore Roosevelt once said, "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena."
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble.
So that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
Seize the day.
Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause.
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
You've got to get mad.
I mean plumb mad dog mean.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
Who at best, if he wins, knows the thrills of high achievement. And if he fails, at least fails while daring greatness.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
Hi once again, everybody. I'm Ed Berliner. Welcome into another special edition of The Man in the Arena. As I said a few moments ago, America is changing, and there's a faction out there in America that doesn't want it to change, or a faction at least that doesn't believe we need change. We do. America has needed change for a very, very long time. And finally, it seems as if we are getting there. But again, it's going to be a fight. It's going to take effort. It's going to take time. And it's also going to take understanding exactly what is at the root cause of what is happening in America right now. The video of George Floyd's murder, everyone has seen. We have seen what has happened in America, on the streets of America, the peaceful protests and also the not so peaceful actions indeed that have happened around in different cities. But it comes down to once again understanding why we are here, what has brought us to this point. And that is the history that we need to understand, and so many people are ignoring. They will not ignore it after today. It is a pleasure to welcome two gentlemen that I have a great amount of respect for and that I have known over the years. First of all, he played professional football in the National Football League for the Miami Dolphins and the Washington Redskins, and I was there when he was a rookie, which again shows how old we both are at this point. But he still looks the same as he did when he was a rookie and hasn't changed a bit. Keith Sims is our guest today. Keith, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Nice to see you again.
It's great to see you again. Also, here in South Florida, I have had the opportunity to get to know a number of outstanding journalists, men and women who have spent their time in this community and know exactly what it is like to go through so much. I mean, and even here in South Florida, we've gone through a lot of these things that we're going to talk about today. He spent his time, it was CBS for a short time, but for the most part it was NBC6, where he spent over 30 years as one of the more outstanding and well-respected journalists in South Florida, and it's the media side of things we need to talk about today as well. It's a pleasure to welcome Ed O'Dell to the Man in the Arena. Ed, it's great to see you again.
It's really good to see you guys. Thank you so much. Keith, loved watching you play. Ed, love your sports cast.
It goes back to all those years. He did sports 100 years ago, and thankfully we've moved on to something that might be a little more necessary to talk about than sports, but I still get around to it every now and then. And we are going to talk a little bit about sports here today, too, because of Keith's responsibilities and Keith's actions and Keith's career in the NFL. And there's also a couple of people who are talking about it. We'll hear from Terry Crews in a couple of moments and what he said about his time in the National Football League, which is interesting. But, gentlemen, let's start out this right here because I decided that this was going to be a conversation about being black in America, which is what this country needs to understand what it is like. I know I got taught many years ago when I was schooled by Jim Brown in a network interview where Jim Brown said to me, "My brother, you have no idea what it is like to be black in America." And I tried to argue with him. I was young and stupid. And many years later, I apologized to Jim Brown because he took me to school and taught me an awful lot. And as I sat down and thought about it, I said, you got to stop being so ignorant and open up your eyes to what's going on. And that really helped open mine. So let's begin simply with this. I'll start with you, Keith.
Mhm.
What was it like growing up black in America?
That's certainly a loaded question for me and my upbringing, because I grew up in a very mixed culture when I was really young. And then my parents made a decision when I was in third grade that focused on the education of their children. So they decided back then that they were going to move to the best possible neighborhood they could and put us in the best public school system they could, which caused us to move from New York to New Jersey. I went from a mixed community to an all-white community. And when I say all-white, and I'm talking about, we had 1,200 kids in our high school, 365 in our graduating class. There were 3 black students out of 1,200. One of them in that class was my sister. The other happened to be a mixed student who was a class president and a pianist. So my background in that was very stark growing up. It was a great educational opportunity, but we lacked in the social interaction. My parents did a great job of trying to involve us in our own cultural activities, that kind of thing. But I come from that background, and then going from there to Iowa State, which was another great experience, but predominantly white university. It was stark. It really was a stark wake-up call for me. A lot of times, I didn't notice a big difference until something happened. You know, they always talk about the NFL, you're welcome to the NFL moment. Well, that welcome to being black in America moment happened on the playground when the first time I was called the N-word for no reason. And I didn't understand how to deal with it. I'm like, what are these people talking about? Why are you singling me out? Well, that was the first time I felt, hey, I'm being treated differently. And this is going back in the 70s.
How old were you then?
I was probably about 12 years old. My first fight in school was because of that, because someone called me the N-word, and of course, I was going to blows over that. But I think from that moment on, I knew and I felt I was really different than everybody else. I have some great friends that I grew up with, great friends to this day from grade school, high school, but I think I disconnected a little bit. I mean, people talk a lot about how great high school was. Well, high school worked for me. I did very well academically. I did very well athletically, but I couldn't wait to get the heck out of there. I couldn't wait to get to an area where there was more of people that looked like me around. And even in Iowa, there were 10, 20% of the school was black. So that was a huge awakening for me. I mean, it was so nice to be walking down the street and see somebody that looked like you. I didn't feel alone anymore. And that continued on through the NFL. And I have my own personal stories of being black in America where I've been profiled. I've been followed in stores in Iowa. I've been accused of stealing. I've been pulled over in Miami as a young player because I was driving a Lexus, and there was no way that a 23-year-old black man could have a Lexus and put on the street for 2 hours while they tried to run everything. I mean, there's so many instances, and most of us have these stories of disrespect and that privilege that we aren't treated the same. So it's very difficult for anybody to understand what it's like to grow up black in America. Because Ed, you and I could walk in a room together. You could walk in first and you're not a threat. But the moment I walk in that room, I'm a threat to other people for whatever reason, because of the way society has put that on our shoulders, that a black man, and put a large black man, oh my goodness, he's a threat for violence or he's a threat to steal something. And that's a very difficult thing to shoulder and grow up with your entire life.
It's funny you say that because that, again, goes back to the Jim Brown experience I had where he then said to me, you have no idea what it's like to be in my skin. And I tried to say, well, an intelligent man can certainly figure it out and can certainly, no, it stopped right there. And that was, again, my youthful white arrogance that simply didn't understand, and then I took the time to learn and to understand. Ed, to you then, the same question then. What was it like for you? And again, it came certainly at a different time for you than Keith in different places. What was it like growing up black in America?
It was everything you see in those horrible movies and on television and history books. I lived the Jim Crow era. I was born and raised in Miami. I lived here most of the year. A lot of the time I spent in North Florida. Back in those days, I was born in 1950. Back in those days, basically anything north of the Dade County line was considered South Alabama or South Mississippi. It was brutal. The whole thing of black only, colored only, water fountains and the back doors and the total insult. And that's what it is. It's an insult to African Americans that this country made us suffer. I did all of that. I was a part of school integration efforts in 1954. I ended up in the hospital at four years old with a brick in my head because my forehead with stitches, because, as Keith said, someone called me the N-word, and it turned into something. I lived in unlike Keith, I lived in an all-black community. Went to all black schools, all black churches. It wasn't until I was 14 that I went to school, that was 1964, that I went to school with white kids. It was a terrible time. They abolished the PTA, they abolished the cheerleaders, they abolished anything that African Americans could join because they just weren't ready for us. It was an excellent experience. The next year, as I went to, now I'm 15, I went to the first school in the state of Florida to integrate. There was a high school. It was Archbishop Curley High down here. It was an incredible experience. Just last month, I was having drinks with friends of mine that I played football with in high school. And one of them leaned over to me and said, Ed, I want to ask you, did we have any problems at that school? I said, no. I said, black and white? He said, yeah. I said, no. He said, well, I'm going to confess to you. And this goes to your point, Keith, and this goes to Jim Brown's point. He said, I'm going to confess. Do you remember when we went to play football against the South Dade Rebels? They had a rebel flag. I said, oh, I remember. And he said, it was then, as we were leaving the game, and we got pelted with rocks and bottles, and I think gunshots, that I sat there on that bus quietly saying, wow, this is what my black teammates go through every single day. He had no idea. So yeah, it's very difficult. But I want to just say something about, I told you about the ugly side. A great thing, I grew up in a place called Overtown, which has made a lot of national news over the decades. It was an incredible experience growing up in an all-black community. It was what we called Harlem South. All of the entertainers you could, I took swimming lessons with Lena Horne out by the pool. Nat King Cole and Sammy Davis Jr. used to get their hair done in the same barbershop that I went to. There was this tall, skinny kid. It used to run down the street in Overtown, talking a big bunch of trash. His name was Cassius Clay.
As soon as you said it, I said it had to be Cassius.
It was before he fought Sonny Liston. We down the street was the doctor, was the lawyer, was the travel agent, was the restaurant, was the black hotel with the pool on top. Sam and Dave. There was a guy that used to come by our apartment building on Friday nights. My mother had a card game with her friends, and there's a guy who'd come by and practice jokes with us. His name was Flip Wilson. It was an incredible experience. Teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, the pharmacists, everybody lived there. That community was actually destroyed by an expressway they ran through it and integration. So, and in the country with my grandparents, I've seen the trucks full of angry men come to pick up one of my cousins because he had the temerity to insult, they said, a woman, a blonde-haired woman, who asked him to, wipe the mud off my shoes. I just stepped in mud. He refused to do it, and the next thing he knew, he was surrounded. And so it's an experience like none other. I'm glad my children don't have to go through it. As difficult as it is, they live like Keith grew up now in a predominantly a white neighborhood. But they've been profiled. I remember them coming home one day and they said, we were around the corner on our skateboards, Dad, and the police came and asked, "What are you doing here?" And they told them where they lived, and fortunately, the police officer said, "Oh, that's Ed O'Dell's house. All right, never mind." That's not how they should live. I mean, they shouldn't have to live that. So that was my experience with it.
I think where we're going to, and I wanted to make sure that we got to this to both of you, and Keith, we're going to talk about the NFL too, because I mentioned Terry Crews at the top, and what he said I think was prophetic indeed in the way he talked about it. Ed, I also want to talk about the media as well, and the way that and I make a big difference between the legitimate press and the clickbait media, and there's a huge Grand Canyon-esque gulf between the two, and with the legitimate media, we have a much greater chance of getting the truth, while the clickbait media is the one out there on both sides, and certainly on one side of the line, that is constantly throwing out lies and fraud and invectives, and what basically comes down to racial hate, no matter how you slice it one way or another. But if we talk about history, and it's already been mentioned briefly, as we sit here today doing this show live, we are just a couple of days after NASCAR decided to finally get rid of the Confederate flag at all their events, even though 6 years ago they said at that time it's time to get rid of it, but they didn't take the rule and enforce it, so it stayed because they were afraid of losing a good part of their base. But what I have seen in the last couple of days from people on both sides of this argument is foul. And I've had this conversation, I mentioned this to Ed before the show started. 15 years ago, I was on the radio and television doing this same argument, saying, why do you spend so much time with the flag? It's our heritage. Really? You want to stand on that? You really want to live with that part? So to start off that part of the conversation, because that's really where a lot of this began and how a lot of it gets propagated to today. Shannon Sharp, who I've had a couple of run-ins over the years, and Shannon's all mouth. You got to love him. But there's times when Shannon speaks his mind on FS1, and he absolutely nails it. And when I saw this, I said, we have to include this, because when it comes down to the argument about the Confederate flag, nobody I've seen has put it into such stark and absolutely truthful terms.
That flag was for the Confederacy. That the sole reason they wanted to succeed from the Union, Skip, is because they wanted to continue slavery. That's it. That flag was founded in the principle of hatred, bigotry, and racism. Now, if you believe the American flag is supposed to be the home of the free and the brave, and you enjoy freedoms and liberties, If you think the Confederate flag is anything other than that, you're sadly mistaken. And they're talking about it's a sense of pride. Oh, you proud to be racist? You proud to be a bigot? Because that's what the Confederacy was. Everybody knows that. It was founded on, I want to own slaves. I want to oppress black people, period. It was not about no, oh, we're brave, we're going to find this land and we want everybody to have. No, you didn't. You wanted black people to be held here. You wanted them to work for you forever and ever. So that's what the Confederate flag is about. It's about nothing else. When people say it's a sense of pride, okay, I understand what your pride is now. So what are you proud about? I just want to, when they say that, I said, so what are you proud about? Because you do understand what it was founded on. You know why they wanted to succeed. So I don't get it, Skip. So this is a no-brainer. And then Brett Kozlowski, like, he's still like, I don't want to tell anybody what they should do. Why not? It's the right thing. You know what the Confederate flag is. Everybody know what the Confederacy was. There was nothing good. And I get it, you know, well, that's a part of it. Yeah, it's a part of history. It's a part of history that needs to be told. But if you think that flag was good, it was maybe for you. Because guess what? You didn't have to bear the burden of what that flag represented. So, of course, it was good for you. It's kind of, Skip, like I told you about you and seafood. You might love seafood, but I have an allergic reaction to seafood. So it's not good for me. Black people have an allergic reaction to the Confederate flag.
I think that last line pretty much said it all. That black people have an allergy to the Confederate flag. Keith, here we are dealing with a piece of cloth. Yet, what it stands for is vile. It is racist at its core. What does it say to you, then, that there are people out there going, I stand for it. It's heritage, it's history, and they just don't get it. They say that we have to keep it because it's history, but they don't understand the pain that it inflicts on an entire race of people dating back to your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. This goes back. This is not happening in 2020. Does this not go back to generations? And it has been brought forward as part of the pain, knowing full well that there are white people who still believe it to this day.
That's true, and I think it dates back to the fact that my belief is there's kind of a whitewashing of history. You know, Shannon talked about what the Civil War was about, and we homeschool our 3 young boys right now, ages 11, 10, and 8 years old. And the main reason why my wife wanted to do that was to make sure that they got true, honest history and true, honest Black history. We RV. That's one of the big things we do. We travel around, we homeschool, we RV them. And we have traveled from Florida to Maine out to South Dakota. And we have stopped at every possible African-American museum that we could. We have marched across the Edmund Pettit Bridge in Selma on the 52nd anniversary a couple years ago with 10,000 other people because we wanted to hear and understand our true history. When you look at schools today, the history that they're teaching is not what is factual. They are whitewashing the history. In the Civil War now in history classes was not about slavery or the right to own slaves. It was about states' rights. Well, isn't that easier to teach than it is the atrocity of enslaving Black people?
Well, sure, it was about the state's rights to want to continue to own Black people. That's exactly what the right was they were fighting for. End of the story.
But that's the part that is de-emphasized. It's the states' rights to do this inhumane atrocity. No, they leave that out. So I think when you look at the Confederate flag, they have brainwashed generation after generation after generation that the Confederate flag, which really wasn't even the Confederate battle flag, was something to be prideful of. You turned against your country, and we should take that symbol as a prideful thing?
That's the next thing that has to be discussed. Those who were part of the Confederacy, most of them were West Point trained generals who then turned against the United States. They were traitors to this country. They sought to break the United States in half, And they simply took it in a military action, which frightens me every single time when I hear people go, we're part of the Confederacy. Yay, Confederacy. You tried to destroy the United States, and here you people are. These are the first people who will tell you that I stand for the United States. Bullshit. You're not standing for the United States. If you did, you'd understand the traitorous nature of the people involved and exactly why they were there. I'm sorry I got in your way, but that's my soapbox. I had to get on that because that happens every time.
I understand.
It catches me every time. Ed, I mean, you sit here as well, too, and we're part of the media, and we have been our entire lives. And there are, once again, the legitimate press that is out there who will put this story forward, yet we are also then inundated by the clickbait, biased media who are not news people, who are not news professionals, who are simply in it for the dollar, who will look to use, and they are still to this day, to this moment as we speak, using the Confederate flag as a spear, as a weapon, if you will, to continue to push forward their side of the white versus black battle that is going on in this country. I don't know, Ed, how we fight that, because there are people who look at it and go, that's the truth, not what Keith or we're talking about here today.
One of the worst parts of this whole new mode of communication is that anybody can take part. Anybody can get on Facebook. Anybody can get on Twitter. Anybody can get on anything and post their ideas. Unfortunately, it is up to individuals like myself, when I look at this stuff, and I've gotten caught a few times, to understand that it's not truth. It is just because somebody posts something that it is not true. But nobody has any time to look, and this is on both sides, to look and research things to understand what is really going on. No one wants to take that time. Everybody wants their agenda to be recognized.
That's the word, agenda.
Yeah, it's their agenda to be recognized. So I'm not going to listen to anything you have to say because you don't, express my agenda. And as long as that's happening, the problem is that, it's growing and the clicks are happening and people are getting advertisers and people are just, this is where people are getting their news. We can go back to the legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate news sources. But, young people are looking at this stuff and they're saying, did you hear? And they're posting and reposting. It's incredibly insane. And I also, have to say that even a lot of the young journalists don't have the experience to understand what the history of things were about. When you started talking about the flag, for me, the Confederate flag is obnoxious, but it's also, for me and my kids, it creates fear. I took my oldest son, up to near Central Florida, out on the West Coast, to look at a university when he was in his senior year. And I said, you could do well at this university. And he looked at me and said, Dad, did you just see that giant Confederate flag waving over I-75? And I said, yes. He said, Dad, do you really want to leave me in this kind of environment?
Children are a lot smarter than we give them credit for sometimes.
Yeah. So it's but yeah, the new, what counts as news these days is incredibly disheartening, and it's very, very dangerous.
Is it not fair to say, too, that if we're going to look at history, we need to look back because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, this is not new. We're not talking about something here that is a necessary item that all of a sudden popped up onto our radar, and we have to take care of the inequality in America. Land of the free, home of the brave. Look, I remember Richard Pryor, I think, who said it in one of his bits, where he said, I know all about justice. That's what it is for you white people, just us. And I remember when I first saw that, and I said, damn, that's prophetic. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he's right. And it is a history that is pockmarked with things that can't be just tucked away. Here, let's start from here. We talk about what happened to George Floyd, but let's go back for a moment and think about the fact that if you want, you can get on YouTube and you can search it out and you can bring out the brutal, heinous beating of Rodney King that to this day resonates with so many people. And if you think about it, this is part of the issue that we're talking about. This never goes away, gentlemen. These are the things that are seared in the minds of black Americans that tell them that you can tell me all you want that we're trying, but I'm going to go back to 1991. And is it fair to say, and I'll throw this out to whomever wants to take it, that from that day to now, nothing has really changed?
Well, Ed, I don't know if you can say nothing's changed. I think change is violent. Change is a slow process. And I think things have changed. And the reason why I'm hopeful, and I'm going to be hopeful with this, is because when you see the protest and you see the thousands of people out there in the street after what happened to George Floyd, it's different than the protest of Rodney King. You see more whites, you see more mixed colors in there, you see young people. And the young people are what it's going to take for us to change this country. When you go back, I mentioned I was at Selma. And when I went to Selma and experienced that, now this is 51 years after the actual Bloody Sunday, I met a historian from Montgomery. And he took us to the Capitol. He was there on Bloody Sunday. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. And he told my boys and us about his experiences. Just like, Edwin, I was shaking my head when you were telling me about your experiences growing up. My heart goes out to you, and I'm glad you were able to overcome that. But to understand what it was like in the 60s, we're in 2020. Times have changed. The Me Too movement has come. That's changing society. It's time that this country faces up for what it did to Black Americans and change.
Well, but I'm going to take you back to the 60s, though. You brought the 60s into this, so let's go back even further. Let's go back to Watts and the Watts riots in Los Angeles. And that's where so many people said, okay, we've got a problem in this country. We need to address it. However, here we have the burning of cities, the looting, the rioting that went on, the cops beating, the National Guard, the military in there. And some people will say, it hasn't changed. Look, here's 1965. And then in 1991, you're still beating black men on the street. So what's really changed? And again, here we go back into history where there's a faction out there that will say, well, we did get better. But did we really?
Well, we've gotten marginally better. Edwin, I'm sorry to cut you off there. We've gotten marginally better. I think we have taken some positive steps. But remember, we are the minority in this country. We're not in power. We can't change it on our own. We need enough white people and enough white folks in power to agree with us that change has to happen. Until we get that, we can talk every single day and nothing's going to change. And I think that's the difference in today's marches and protests than it was 40 or 50 years ago. This historian from Montgomery told me things didn't change. I've had this debate for the last 4 or 5 years with people about the kneeling in the NFL. Why protest on my Sunday, not on my Sunday? And I told him, you know what I learned when I went to Selma is Jim Crow was happening decades before. Abuse and lynchings were happening for generations before. Things didn't change until it was thrust into the living rooms of white America, and enough of white America said, this is wrong, we've got to do something about it. And I think that's what I'm feeling today.
Edwin, is that then, to Keith's point, one of the things which is helpful? I mean, we denigrate social media because in many ways it is the cesspool of the world and has certainly turned into it at Twitter, thanks to some people who over and abuse it many times. But the fact that more people saw what happened to George Floyd, and they saw it in real time. And we are seeing more of these things because there are people out there recording it and putting it up for the world to see. Is it fair to say that that's going to help? And speaking to Keith's point, that then will energize white people to then get more involved because even they are now seeing this is wrong when before it seemed to be hidden away in a certain pocket of life, in a certain facet of mind.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. And I'll give you some examples. I have seen some of my friends whom I've known from television for 30, 40 years. I know them, who have suddenly started, calling me and saying, one of them, one couple said, "Where can I give some money for the cause?" And I had them define the cause. And they said, we have to do something to help bring about change. There has been change. But the fact of the matter is, what this is saying to me, this whole George Floyd thing, listen, I talked to you about growing up in this environment. In my community, Black community, no matter who you were, no matter what kind of guy you were, what kind of kid you were, mama was always the top dog. And mama said, when the church lady said, "Let's go," you had to, let's go. I don't care what kind of kid. And to see that man on the ground, played over and over and over again, calling for his mama. That mothers over the years, Black mothers, Black parents. I'm a dad of 3, sons. To not know if your child is coming home. White America doesn't understand that part. That a child can leave a Black home and go into a world where they might not come back. That's what the George Floyd story told us. And there's nothing new about this. 1972, I graduated from college. There was a show on. It was called Sanford and Son. And one of the things that happened when people like Red Fox got on television, they started talking about stuff that wasn't really talked about. And one of the things that I'm sure America laughed at, was one day in the show, Lamont, Sanford's son, said, "Dad, we got to check for diabetes. Do you know that diabetes kills more Black people than any other group in America?" And Fred Sanford said, Red Fox said, "I thought it was the police." I know it brought laughs back then, but there was a truth even back then. We all knew that stepping out into the world, things could happen because you were Black, because you were considered less than. How are you considered less than? The United States of America, working with North and South, working with the South, said only count Black Americans as 3/5 of a human being for taxation and for the census. They'd say, well, that was slavery, or that was it exists. It has been passed down and down and down. My soon-to-be 24-year-old son will step out of the door in this community, and I spoke to one of the police chiefs, the white police chief, about this. And he will step out of the door at 10 o'clock at night, take off his shirt and go jogging in this white community for an hour. I'm worried. Why should I be worried? Why do I have to live this way, hoping that nothing happens to my son. You know, one of the biggest things we've seen with New York, the situation in New York with the police were called on and the woman got fired, thank God. You know, willfully calling the police just because you see a black person, that has not changed. The scary black man image has not changed in America. It is lots of change. When I walked into television in 1972, I wasn't welcomed. There was one black reporter. Now we see a lot more. Yeah, there's that kind of change you can talk to. But mama is still worried about her black child walking out of the door. And until that changes, it's not, and we can stay alive, it's not going to happen. Last thing I'm going to say, you're right about what we're seeing in the communities now. We're seeing these young white people out in these demonstrations. I hope they're starting a revolution. Mm-hmm. Because the fact of the matter is, it was back in the 60s when black and white students started the freedom rides. They came down to the South to integrate bus terminals. They were beaten, they were spat upon, they were arrested. But when those white kids were arrested for being arm in arm with black kids, it brought international attention to something that had been happening all the while. And these young people taking part now are bringing international attention.
Why hasn't it changed then? Because we've talked about the rebel flag that has a culture that has existed for more than 100 years. We've talked about Watts. We've talked about Rodney King. There, of course, was Overtown in Miami, which you and I were both a part of in news careers covering. Why? And you mentioned the woman in Central Park who got on her cell phone and said there's an African-American man who's, I don't remember her exact words, but she had to make the point of saying that when she called the police. Why haven't we changed? The evidence is there every single day that racism is systemic in this nation, and there is a problem. Are we just ignorant to what's happening?
I think ignorance can be a strong word in some respects. I think you hear people, white people say this all the time. Well, why didn't they just obey? You know, a black person gets pulled over and ends up getting killed. Well, they must have been doing something wrong. Why did they just listen? Well, you've seen it now on videotape. I could be holding my hands up and get shot. You know, I could be saying, hey, I'm pulling this out, or I'm following your orders and get shot and killed. I think until that stops, and I think video is a big key of helping people see it and not be able to dismiss it as they automatically assume if a black person is involved in something, they were doing something wrong. They shouldn't have been there. They weren't listening. They were offensive. And I can tell you, again, grew up in this white area. I've been in a car or cars with my white friends, and we've been pulled over by the police. And I was trained, shut up, keep your hands visible, be respectful. And I've never heard people be more disrespectful to police officers than these white teenagers. Why the heck did you stop me? Blah, blah, blah. I couldn't imagine. I was in fear sitting in that car, in that passenger seat, of the way they were acting. But they had no fear. They had no fear whatsoever of the repercussions of being arrested, being beaten, or being killed by the police just because they were driving black. Because they weren't. They were driving white. It's that inherent white privilege that it doesn't apply to them. Just like you mentioned, the lady in Central Park. Mm. She called the police and said, this black man's harassing me, because she knew inherently. Did somebody sit her down and tell her this is what you say? No. She was taught that systematically, that as a white woman, the whole world is going to come to your rescue.
Okay.
Whether it's true or not.
There's that word. And there's the derivative of that word is systemic. Yes. Which I still don't believe that a lot of people quite understand that, because it's thrown out as a phrase, and as a matter of fact, it's being thrown around the White House here in the days that we are now doing this show live, that it would seem that even at the highest levels of government, even they don't understand what systemic racism is. Here's a report from Brian Williams in the 11th hour on MSNBC.
There's a new conversation afoot about the phrase systemic racism. I'll offer you this. We'll talk about it on the other side.
Does the president feel that there is systemic racism in law enforcement?
He believes most of our police officers are good, hardworking people. There's a lot of evidence of that, and he has great faith in our police department.
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist.
I don't believe there's systemic racism in the U.S.
Not because any systemic racism against African Americans in the United States?
I would say it again, I do not.
So, Eugene, that's three people saying everything's fine.
Yeah, no systemic racism. I mean, I don't understand why the administration's trying to plant the flag there, because the enemy has already advanced far beyond that point. I mean, this is a moment where many Americans who may previously have sort of been close to the idea sort of get the concept of systemic racism. White Americans who might in the past have seen it as the phrase as some sort of threat to them or accusation directed at them, rather than actually a neutral description of the reality of American life.
Okay, so the words from Eugene Robinson, and now let me follow up, and again, I'll throw it out to the two of you gentlemen as we discuss this in the words systemic racism. You heard and you saw the people who are watching and the people who are listening, members of the administration saying that there is no such thing as systemic racism. All white people, let's add that in there as well. However, I'm going to play devil's advocate in part of this discussion as well. What Kayleigh McEnany said is what a lot of people still believe to this day with regard to police departments across America. They will say, wait, there are the bad apples, there are the people who are out there who will do bad things, and we have to understand, and there is a groundswell of this from people who are part of law enforcement who will say that we're not all that way. You can't paint us all with the same brush. So what you're doing is you're creating, in their mind, you're creating systemic racism because you're taking everybody as one big group and saying, that's the problem. How do we answer that to people who say that it's unfair to go after all of law enforcement when they're not all racist?
So anyway, Ed, I don't know if you remember, and Keith, I probably don't. I'm like one of the only journalists I ever heard of that graduated from police SWAT school.
I remember.
Miami Police SWAT School. So I had a lot of good relationships with a lot of police officers. The fact of the matter is, it almost goes back to the old church lady saying one bad apple spoils the barrel. But if the police department allows these things to exist, allows a George Floyd to be killed by one of their officers, then they are supporting the racism that exists in the department.
The thin blue line.
Yeah, the thin blue line. Things have to change. Here in Miami, just yesterday and just last week, it was announced that every police department, save two, had gotten rid of the chokehold that has killed so many people, so many African Americans. The fact of the matter is, all of a sudden, the largest police department in the state of Florida realized we're still doing the chokehold. What do you mean? Yesterday, the director of the Miami-Dade Police Department came out and said, "Oh, we're getting rid of that." But he's brand new. It had existed for decades and no one had done anything about it. So you're supporting a system that can take the life of a person. You are supporting racism, brutality, and the like. So you can't separate the police departments from those who are not, taking charge and moving these things away. At the same time, just last week, I spoke to a police chief who said, I'm not hearing this knee stuff. Never happened in my department. And the union came after me big time because one of my young officers saw something that veteran officers were doing and thought they would get away with it. The police officer came to me and said, I've got to report this. I can't handle this. That police chief went against the union, went against his department, and fired those veteran police officers. That is not happening across America. People are saying in these police departments, well, it's the thin blue line, I've got to support. This guy, brand new police officer, what are they going to say about him in the station? That was a bold move, but he was supported by the police chief. Where is that happening?
Sure, well, we're walking back to, for those people who remember the days of Frank Serpico in the New York City Police Department, where he was the first one that really came out and reported what was happening and how he was ostracized and how he was almost killed several times for what he did.
Several times because they want to keep the status quo. Well, the status quo has racial elements to it. And so the departments get painted with that brush.
I want to bring up that, to make sure to get this in here, on the comment section right now, there is a very good friend of mine who is watching this broadcast live. He is a police officer, and he is also a Muslim police officer. And I've had him as a guest on my show many times. We've discussed this over the years. His words to me is, there is a very systemic racism problem in this country that plagues every type and level of government: police, education, healthcare. And he points out, I hear the same stereotyping about Muslims. It again is part of the white America that says, hands off, don't say anything. And I'm going to speak to your point, Ed. What needs to happen is, from police officers, fire department, education, whatever it is, you need to get in front of this. If you see something that's gone wrong, if you see someone committing a crime, if you see someone doing something that is heinously evil, God damn it, report them. Get in there. Say something. Don't fear it. We're living in a nation of fear at this point where, shh, I don't want to say anything because I'll become a pariah. If you're a cop, that's your job, to serve and to protect. And if you're taking somebody that you work with and you're covering up from them, you're not serving anybody and you're not protecting anybody. So isn't it fair to say that we've got to get to the point with police departments in this country where there is not a fear, where the police unions are not in there saying that we run the show, and let's face it, a lot of places they do, to where the cops in America have to not be afraid to make sure that they cross that blue line and erase it and get the apples out of there instead of hearing the same stuff for decades that we've heard before.
I'm going to let Keith talk, but I just wanted to say this. I know the vast majority of police officers I know
absolutely
are racist. And there is just absolutely no way. I know police chiefs, retired chiefs, directors. I know they're not, but that element still exists, and they are passing it down with these new officers. That's my concern.
Totally agree. And I'll take another situation to bring it to light. When you looked at a couple weeks ago when the armed militia stormed the Michigan House and was dressed in bulletproof vests and AK-47s, not one thing happened to them. They were yelling and screaming in the face of police. You tell me what would have happened in that same situation if that were a bunch of black men dressed with AK-47s or a bunch of Muslims. It would immediately have gone south and blood would have been shed. That is what has to change. Why is it okay for a white man to walk down the street? I am a black man. I have a legal permit to carry my firearm. But I would be taken down if I did that openly in the streets versus a white person. Those things have to change, and it's got to change in the perception of the American people, and it's got to change in the perception of the police. Because if I'm seen walking down the street, the calls to 911 are going to be flooding the police station. If it's a white person, I would generally say there's probably not even going to be a single call.
I want to make sure that and I mentioned this earlier in the show, because I want to make sure that we discuss the NFL as well. Because the NFL has both been deliriously wrong in what they have done over the last several years with regard to this issue of race and protests, and certainly Colin Kaepernick. And there's a couple of things here that if people have not heard, I want to make sure that you hear it, and then we will discuss this as well. First of all, whether or not he did it on his own or with the permission of his bosses. And frankly, I bet you Keith is going to nod his head on this one, because there's no way in hell that a commissioner of the National Football League would say anything like this unless he was given the okay to do it, because he still answers to his masters, who are the guys who pay his multi-million-dollar salary. So those who are saying that he did it rogue, stop. Don't even start that conversation here. But when Roger Goodell came out and made this statement, there was something missing that many people, quite frankly, didn't hear.
It has been a difficult time for our country, in particular, Black people in our country. First, my condolences to the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all the families who have endured police brutality. We, the National Football League, condemn racism and the systematic oppression of Black people. We, the National Football League, admit we were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest. We, the National Football League, believe Black lives matter. I personally protest with you and want to be part of the much-needed change in this country. Without Black players, there would be no National Football League. And the protests around the country are emblematic of the centuries of silence, inequality, and oppression of Black players, coaches, fans, and staff. We are listening. I am listening. And I will be reaching out to players who have raised their voices and others on how we can improve and go forward for a better and more united NFL family.
Keith, we all listened. What didn't we hear?
We didn't hear a single thing about Colin Kaepernick, who started this protest years ago. And I have been in discussions with people I meet, because I've supported the kneeling ever since it began. And I think if the league is really being honest here, and I know it's tough because in football, you only have so many years where your abilities are going to be at that level where you can play in the NFL. Someone needs to sign Colin Kaepernick and give him a true opportunity. I have had so many debates. People said white people say, oh, he's not on a team because his skills aren't there. That's a bunch of horse crap. There's only so many people can throw the ball effectively in this world. And he is one of probably the top 40, top 50 quarterbacks in the world. So he should be on an NFL roster. And the hypocrisy of the league and teams in particular, because they preach to us. I've taken pain-numbing injections for 2 different NFL teams over multiple weeks because they preach to us the team is more important than the individual. You got to do this for the team. We are trying to get the best 53 guys together. Well, if Colin Kaepernick isn't on a roster in the NFL, they don't have the best 53 guys in this world on every team. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we will see those steps move forward.
But at least mention him as part of it without just
calculated. He went, you said, do I believe that Goodell had approval of all 32 owners? I don't believe he had approval of all 32 owners to make that statement.
I will go with you there because we both know, you and I both know, there are certain owners in the NFL who would never say that out loud because of their own systemic racism and the problems that they've caused in the past. But can we not agree that Goodell would not have gone rogue and simply put that out there, that somebody had to give him the okay to do that?
The only way he would have gone rogue is if he's about ready to retire.
Or ready to be fired.
But his contract's probably guaranteed he's going to collect his money if they fire him. So, but I don't know the man. I've never met Roger Goodell, but I truly believe that he got some counsel from at least a few owners that he wasn't going to have his butt flailing to win by himself versus 32 billionaires.
And in response to Goodell, I mentioned this much earlier in the show. I want to make sure we get this in there. Terry Crews who played in the National Football League years ago, now is the host on America's Got Talent, and has a brilliant career. He appeared on Late Night with Seth Meyers, and this is the intimation here of something that you're talking about, Keith, because people over the years believe that the National Football League has always been a bastion of making sure that they care for their players of all colors and they don't take racist tones towards certain colors. And Terry Crews basically, listen close, and you'll hear exactly what he says.
I thought I would never see this. It was a moment that, it stands in time even to this day to watch, Roger Goodell actually admit that they were wrong. Because again, I left the NFL 23 years ago, and it still is, but racism was prevalent all the way throughout. But there was a lot of indignities that I had to just put up with simply because I wanted to, make conditions better for my family. That's the way it was. And to see this happen, and especially, and one of the big things, and I have to call, Roger on this though, is just the fact that they did not mention Colin Kaepernick, right, which is still the most glaring example of racism that the NFL has ever had, and they could correct it. But I'm really, really hoping that Kaepernick gets a chance to show himself on an NFL field, which would really mean healing. It would really take, the NFL seriously on everything they're saying right now.
Keith, with regard to what he intimated, is there still racism in the National Football League?
Absolutely. I mean, let's not even talk about the quarterback position. The quarterback is defined as a black quarterback. He's athletic, and there's always a question of, can he be smart enough? Fine, he's got a good arm and good legs, but can he think on his feet? That is still prevalent in the NFL to this day. When you look at the different positions, I mean, you look at receiver, you look at offensive line. I know when I came in the league in 1990, there were questions about black offensive linemen. Are we smart enough to think on our feet? Can we do it? Yeah, you're athletic, but are you smart enough to handle the sophisticated systems? Those thought processes are still prevalent in the NFL today, particularly at the high quotient skill positions, cornerback, quarterback, offensive line. Oh, if he's athletic, he's black, put him at defensive line. We can teach him to go chase the football, but can you teach him to make a split-second decision?
So I wanted to, jump in here. I have to say that, we talked about police departments. We can talk about the government. We can talk about, if racism exists in America, yes, then it exists in all segments of America. So I didn't play professional football, but I can believe that, it still exists there. I found Mr. Dell's statement disingenuous because he didn't mention Colin Kaepernick, because he didn't say, we've reached out to Colin Kaepernick and apologized to him to say, listen, we got it wrong, you had it right. It's a good thing that he did this. And I also find something else disingenuous, and this is the old guy here. Yeah, if there were no black players, guess what? You would still have an NFL. You had an NFL when there were no black players. But you know what? You wouldn't be making the money you're making. And you would not have these men tearing up their bodies. God bless you, Keith. I'm happy to see you looking so good, man. And because, I watched some of the former Dolphins passing away with, with some of the problems that they came out of football with, especially the 72 team. But, the fact of the matter is, it's a good statement. I'm a PR guy. I would have written that statement as well. I doubt if I would have gotten him to say, but can't we say Colin Kaepernick was correct and we were wrong and we apologize? Back in 1968, Mexico, we talked about this, Ed, when, those gentlemen stood on that podium, John Carlos, and they raised that
Carlos and Smith, yep.
Yeah, But there was a third guy, an Australian guy, who stood there with them.
Finished second, yep.
Australia. Yep, and he was ostracized. Well, there was support here in this country for John Carlos, but there was nothing for him. You know, this stuff exists in every segment of this country, and it exists in other countries as well. You know, I guess it's the old saying, you can't get well until you admit that you're sick. And that admission is not happening to the extent it needs to.
Gentlemen, we have led ourselves to this point here at near the end of the show that we have to discuss, because we have touched on what is indeed systemic racism in this country. We have touched on a nation that has been on fire, intellectually, physically, mentally, in the last several weeks, but a nation that needs to change, and many people who are fighting that change, who don't believe there needs to be a change, who are calling it Antifa, if you will, or some other group that is in there. They're making up boogeymen in the world today. That's the problem. But let's get to the higher level here. With what is happening in America now, and again, I will leave it to whomever wants to take this first, because this is the one that so many people fear to tread on, but it needs to be asked. How much of the responsibility for what is happening in America right now rests on the shoulders of our government, our leadership, and specifically President Donald Trump?
So I will say this. I'll take the lead on this one. Two of my sons, 3 sons, voted in the last election for the first time. And I made sure they got polled. I was stunned by the election results. I believe that what happened here in America, I believe that it revealed what was really happening in America. There was this, they had been shouted down, and I'm just going to say they had been shouted down at the campfire. You go back to the Native American or the first Americans. They've been shouted down at the campfire. They saw an opportunity to step. Were they created? I don't think so. I think they saw an opportunity to come back and say, no, we don't want change. I'm going to go back to the media to say finish. In the newsroom, if they came to me and said, Ed, we need a lot of new young reporters. We need some new blood in here. And I'm going to say, oh my God, wait a minute, you're getting rid of me? To bring some new people in? I don't want to lose my power. So, bringing new blood, black people, red, people, the First Nations people, bringing in the gay and lesbians, that shrinks my power. We saw that during, with the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Amendment, when, against, discrimination in the workplace. What happens? You bring in black people, you bring in women, you bring in, the first Americans, you bring in all of these people. Well, somebody's got to go. I don't want to give up my power. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a power struggle. That's my position.
How does that relate then? I'm not going to let you get off the hook.
Okay.
How does that relate then to whether or not Donald Trump is part of the problem?
What Donald Trump seems to represent, it is a part of the problem because he has brought these people out. And there is, the power brokers in Congress. He's an impeached president. I had nothing to do with that. It was Congress, it was, the House. But the people who hold the power to get him out of office, they're not going to do it. So all of this is systemic as well. And it keeps us going in the same direction.
Keith, then to you, because there are those who say that he has ratcheted up the temperature, and by doing so and by not speaking out and trying to maintain some semblance of peace in the country, that he is just as much to blame, if not more, than anybody else for where we are today?
And in this situation, I firmly believe there's no way you can be in between. Either you are part of the problem or you're part of the solution. You can't try to sit in the middle of this particular situation. And unfortunately, from what I've seen and heard over the last 3 years from this president, I think he's part of the problem. He has not condemned situations when it should be. He hasn't used his platform to benefit all people in America. And that's what the president is supposed to do. Not divide us. It's supposed to bring us all together. You can't please us all, and I understand that. But if he doesn't believe and is not going to support the destruction of the systematic racism, then he's not helping the cause, and hence you're hurting the cause.
Then where do we go from here? We've talked about all the problems. So before we leave, I'll throw it to the both of you. Keith, I'll let you get to it first then. Knowing where we're at in this country now, and knowing that there is a tremendous problem in this nation right now with racism, and this is a racist nation at its core in many ways, how do we fix it?
I think the easiest way and the most effective way we can do it right in the next 6 months is to vote, and vote in masses, and hold whoever you vote for accountable. And I don't mean just vote for the president. I mean, you need to start at state, you need to start at county, local level, school boards. You need to vote for people who are going to look out for the best interests of all of us and not support systematic racism. And make sure you're registered to vote. If we don't get registered to vote and go out in masses, nothing's going to change. Because what you have seen, and I've seen it with my own eyes, there is a systematic oppression of the vote. And if voting didn't matter, people who died for the right to vote, Black Americans died for the right to vote. If it didn't matter, then why would they care? It matters. You want things to change? Vote the people who stood by and did nothing. Vote the people who enhanced the systematic racism. Get them all out of office. And we've got to get other people to run. And then once you get new people in, it can't be the same old show. If they don't live up to their promises, they need to be voted out of the house. It's not voting every 4 years. There's elections every single year, and we all need to do our civic duty and take part in it.
Edwin?
100% agree. Look, I believe there's two things, there are possibilities right now. I think the voting is, I think at every protest, there should be a table to register to vote. They're not doing that. They're missing a major opportunity. People are coming together. People who don't vote, get them to register to vote now. They have this opportunity. People are in the streets. People are singing songs. The vote is huge. We have to, again, as you say, have the right people in office. That thing that I talked, the director of the Miami-Dade Police Department, he had conversations with powerful Black elected officials who said this can't continue. And he, I'm not going to say he didn't have a choice, but he had to say, we are going to look into this. And it's also important for such a time as this, for these young people to say, I'm going to be a new leader. I'm just not going to be out here in the street marching. I'm going to be a new leader. I talked to you about the marches that, back in the 60s. Two of the people that came out of those marches, that for sit-ins and the like to, integrate lunch counters, was Congresswoman Frederica S. Wilson from the 24th District here in Florida. And one of the others, and we both went to the same school, she was a little bit ahead of me, and another guy who went to the same school, who did the same marches, was a guy named John Lewis. They came out of this situation. We need to grow our own right now, but we need to start at the voting booth. And if they don't start having those tables to register to vote at these marches and protests, you're missing a bet.
I get the sense that this is going to turn a tide. I could be very naive, but hopefully what we're seeing right now is at least some sort of movement towards finally understanding that it is home of the brave, land of the free, but it's supposed to be for everybody. Doesn't make a difference whether you're white, black, blue, green, male, female, and hopefully we're finally getting to that point, but damn it, it's been a long ride, and I'm with the both of you. We have to continue to drive this forward, and we've got to have consistent conversation, but we've got to have frank conversation with this nation. I think this nation is tired of hearing bovine excrement from its leaders, and they need people like us and others to give them the real truth and simply just try to move forward and understand that we're only here for a short time. We may as well go ahead and be together. And I hope, that's why I do shows like this, because I'm hoping that at least it just educates people just a little bit and makes them understand. As Jim Brown told me, I'll go right back to it again, I have no way of knowing what it is like to walk in your shoes, but I have to fight for the right to you to continue to walk in those shoes. And that's what everybody needs to do. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure. I hope the next time we get together, Keith, it's just you and I talking football. And Ed, the next time we get together, you and I be talking about the press and the media. That could be a show that could go on for days. But the time we're done in this country.
I have to say one more thing to you, Ed.
Please.
You are a brave man.
Yes, you are.
There's no way I would get into an argument with Jim Brown.
I will tell you the story. This is 1990, and it was something called Sports News Network that I was brought up to do, and it was the first 24/7 sports news network, and I was one of the 7 original anchors. And it was the first couple of weeks we were there, and the executive producer says, I got Jim Brown. We're lucky enough. We're going to get Jim Brown from Los Angeles, and you're going to interview him. Great. Okay, I'm all set. And Jim is very active. He doesn't talk. Jim Brown doesn't talk football. Jim Brown talks social issues and the things that are hammering away at this country, and he did even then. And when he started to talk about it, there was that hairs on the back of my neck said, oh, I know better than Jim Brown. Sure. But Jim was calm, and he put me in my place, and I got off the set, and the EP looked at me and said, what the hell was that? He says, do you realize what you just said? And I said, yeah, I stood up for myself. He said, oh, no, you go back and watch that tape, and you need to look at it again. And I did, and I watched it 2-3 times, and all of a sudden it was like a light bulb went off. I said, what a schmuck. And it was years later that I actually had a chance to see Jim at an event. And I reminded him of it, and he remembered it. He remembered exactly what he said. I said, I want to apologize. I was all wrong. And he looked at me, as Jim Brown only can. He said, yes, you were. and we had a wonderful conversation after that. But yeah, Ed, that was my moment of you better wake up, kid. You're young and stupid. You don't know everything. And that, I think, is maybe what everybody needs to know. We're all a little young and stupid sometimes, and we don't know everything. But yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, learn my lesson, Edwin. I'm never going to do that one again. That's why I use that story, and I tell people this is how you need to take things like that. Gentlemen, again, it's been a pleasure. I hope we talk to you again real soon. Listen, be safe. Love your families. Take care of yourselves, please. We all stay together on Facebook. We all stay in touch. We'll do it again. Keith and I will tell even more stories. Edwin and I will tell stories as well. I cannot thank you both enough, gentlemen. We'll continue to be honest. Take care and be well to you and your families.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right. Those are 2 guys that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, Keith Sims and Ed O'Dell. Boy, Keith Sims, I could go back and tell stories about him as a rookie, and Shula and all that. Of course, he knows all those stories, so we'll have to tell him one of these days when we're together. I want to thank Keith Sims. I want to thank Ed O'Dell. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody, and it has been an amazing amount of people that have watched us here on Facebook Live. A reminder that this show will be posted on YouTube, plus it will be up on all of the popular audio podcast platforms to listen to as well. In just a couple of moments, you're going to find out exactly where that all is. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Until next time, I'm Ed Berliner. Rock on, true believers. For story ideas, comments, start some interesting debates, or just get in touch, join me on social media at Berliner Speaks on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Also join me on LinkedIn for business and also sponsorship discussions. There you can search out Ed Berliner. Reminder that all of our episodes on Man in the Arena are available on YouTube. Just go to welcometothearena.com. Every episode of Man in the Arena is also available on audio podcast on all of the major platforms. This has been a presentation of Entourage Management, LLC and Entourage Media.